what we're going to be talking about today in this lecture is events and browser events. But before I talk about any of the content, did anyone do anything like particularly fun that they want to share with the class? No, no, no.
I tried to change it to Twitter instead of America because I was uploading it in the thing. It actually called me content, like a content security thing.
Oh, interesting. Okay, nice. Yeah. Okay, good security on them. Anybody else? Yeah.
I replaced the title of the story with stuff from War of the Worlds.
Oh, okay.
Time.
Okay, so you went to like New York Times, just like a random thing here, and just like, did you find a particular one? Do you actually have your code?
It all restarted.
Oh, okay. So you did War of the Worlds, like you replaced one of the articles with like War of the Worlds stuff.
I replaced the title, I replaced the article, I replaced the picture with aliens.
Cool, nice, sweet. Anybody else? Anything else?
I went to the Wall Street Journal and I replaced every picture with the yellow Batman.
Okay, with yellow Batman.
Yeah, that's awful.
Okay, all right.
Wow.
I know. I figured. Anybody else? Anybody else do anything?
Oh yeah, Karma over the airport was 50% off the flat iron.
Solid.
It's just a picture of Batman with
Yeah, that's why.
only yellow underwear and a yellow towel on.
Okay.
And it's just like very badly 3D rendered.
Okay.
It's a very funny picture.
Okay.
You can get me 50% off on that.
No. Anybody else want to share anything? So 50% off Flatiron, War of the Worlds, Yellow Batman. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Hopefully, like as we go through, like as we go along, and as you get better with JavaScript, you'll find like new and inventive ways to mess with the DOM. Like there's a lot of fun ways that you can interact with the page. As I showed you, like that really dumb thing that I had. Where is it? What? No, it's not. Okay. This thing, right? Like, no, where is it? This thing. Actually, I actually want to talk to you about this so far. Does anybody this is the script I showed you. Look at New York Times. What the? Okay. This is the script I showed you the other day that like randomly loads Boston Market commercials wherever you click. So in looking at this, I kind of wanted everybody. Oh, New York. What is this? Come on, seriously. Freaking. Okay, take a look at this. Does anybody recognize? Do you guys recognize the stuff that's in this code? At least some of it. Right. What is familiar here about this code? Technically, actually, most of it.
Familiar?
Yeah. What's familiar about it? Like what have we seen in like from what would you recognize from the previous lecture? Document.createElement. Okay. Right. That should be familiar. I'm making a div here. Yeah, there's some CSS stuff here. Style.position, right? That's how it gets positioned. The inner HTML, right? So I created a div and I put some inner HTML in it. What else? Yeah, there's an anonymous function here, right? What about the append? Is that okay? Yeah. So you actually like already kind of know a little bit about like what's going on here, at least like what's going on inside of this function. But what's new here? Yeah, the document, add event listener, the click event, right? Does anybody notice that I'm using this thing called event over here, right? That's new. The whole point of this lecture is basically to fill in that gap. Like now that you kind of know a little bit about how to manipulate the DOM, we want to sometimes be able to manipulate the DOM in accordance with user interaction. In this particular case, my decision was that I want this DOM manipulation to happen whenever a user clicks, right? And so that's the decision I made, and so like that's part of how this works, right? And that's going to be something that you're going to be thinking about from now on is like, okay, I know how to manipulate the DOM. Now I have to think about how do I want my users to be able to trigger this interaction, right? Look at those rotisserie chickens. Okay. Okay. So that's really the focus of this lecture is like thinking about events. In particular, we are actually focusing on. Earlier we focused on this. This lecture will be focusing on this, right? Allowing for user interaction, or rather, not allowing for user interaction, but reacting to user interaction, right? Like clicking, pressing, whatnot, and so on and so forth. So in particular, what we're going to do is like we're going to talk about events, like how do we actually use them to capture user interaction. We'll look at what are some of there are these things called the event objects, like what is useful on them, like what can they be used for. We'll also identify some commonly used events. And then we'll also combine this with like stuff that we learned earlier, like about DOM manipulation, with events to sort of like get our users to be able to change what's on the page, right? The last thing, and this is actually a lead-in more into tomorrow's lecture in the morning, is actually about event propagation. It's a more technical. We're going to dive. If we have some time, we're going to dive a little bit into this. But tomorrow's lecture is also focused on this. But we'll talk a little bit about event propagation because like there's actually some really cool use cases for that whole idea. But we won't understand what that is. I can't even begin to explain until we get close to that. Does anybody have any questions about like the overall goals of the lecture? Okay. So as I mentioned, we're still like we're trying to react to user interaction. That's like our main thing. Let me ask you guys a question. Just like based on your experience with the internet, which I'm sure is copious and large, what do you think? What are some common ways that you interact with a web page? Scrolling. What else? Clicking. Yeah, in now on phones, swiping. Yes.
Well, even on laptops, like
yeah, touch screens.
Yeah, and then I'm not sure if this would apply to this, but I know Macs aren't, but my trips at home, you can do everything via touchscreen. I'm not sure if those count as clicks.
Yeah, I think that you can also swipe. I don't actually know how that works because the browser's a bit different on like a touch screen tablet. So that's a bit different. I think that they might just be clicks. But anyway,
They
yes.
function the same way depending on how many fingers you're using or whatever.
Yeah. They function the same way, right? But there you go, clicking, swiping. No, keyboard is something else, right?
For gaming, like the space button and arrows.
Totally, that's a different type of interaction. Keyboard presses. Anything else? How else do you? Hovering. Anything else that you can think of? Yeah, there is a resize, I think. But this one's not gonna be. This is more a CSS thing. I'm gonna remove this because that's more of a CSS thing than like a JavaScript thing. Yeah, that's just a click event though. Yeah, they're all considered click events. Anybody else? Anything else? That's all CSS. That's all CSS. Yes, that's media queries. Anybody else?
You might want to save information, but that's not.
No, that is so.
Not something that the web page does.
Kind of. It does do something. So let's actually dig into that. So like web pages, you don't save information on the web page. You save it in a server somewhere, right? But how does the user input information? Typing, which has to do with keyboard pressing, and then eventually, what do they do when you're done typing in your form? You submit. Right? Submitting forms. What's that? No, they're actually different. I'll show you that differently. They're very similar, except like for instance, like on some forms, you notice you can hit enter and it will submit.
Yeah.
Right? That's like one crucial difference between a submit and a click that we'll see as we go along. But the submit is actually a distinct event from clicking. Right? It's not just a click on your button. Dragging is actually different. Yeah. Yeah. You do this with things like Trello. What's up? Zooming is actually like I think more. Are you talking about like what I'm doing here? Oh, that is more like if you're using like maps.google. Like if you do the 2-finger, that's actually I think. Oh, actually no, I don't think that works. Like that's something that has to do with more your computer than anything, not really the browser. I don't know how it's categorized because it's like weird because like PCs you can't do that, right? For instance, actually I guess on PCs you can. Yeah.
If you have a wheel,
Like with the
center wheel on
yeah.
the mouse, if you scroll
That is scrolling. Yeah, that's definitely scrolling. But I don't know how it works with the two finger. Like you can resize with like with the, what is that? I don't know what this pinching. Yeah, pinch and zoom. Like I don't know like what that's categorized under. Those are all like very new sorts of things because like those things didn't exist for a long time.
So like
Um,
gestures?
yeah, I guess gestures. Let's just categorize them into gestures. We won't really see that many we won't really interact with gestures as much. I think this has more to do with your machine. Like I think your machine translates the gestures into like scroll events, for instance, and that's really how it works. But I don't think this is really like something in our purview. The others, however, are still in our purview. These are things that we control from the browser and that we can interact with. Scrolling, clicking, swiping, keyboard pressing, hovering, submitting, dragging, right? These are really common things that we do on a lot of different websites. Primarily, we're going to be focusing on clicking, but like remember that all of these things can be extended to all sorts of events. The things that we learned, they're not really different in other events. But let's talk a little bit about we're going to focus on clicking because it's the most basic one. So the first thing that I want to show you is here's some data. Actually, here's a document. What we're going to do here is, oh, did I lose the, man, okay, sorry, I lost my HTML. Here we go. Okay, so here's some data. As a warm-up to getting to what we're going to do, I want everybody to do a little bit of DOM manipulation first, right, just so we can get a bit of a warm-up. And then what we're going to do is to the stuff that we add on the page, we're actually then going to manipulate the DOM a little bit. We're going to add event listeners and sort of listen for clicks, right? That's actually going to be the objective of today. Now, what I want everybody to do is as a kind of a warm-up exercise to that, you see all this data, right? I want everybody to kind of in partners figure out a way to go through this data, iterate through this data, and produce. Actually, okay. You don't need to actually write the code here. Actually, 1 second. Okay, I'll get rid of some of this stuff. Okay, cool. I want everybody to kind of go through this data and figure out, and you can just talk about it, is how would you take this data, iterate through this data, and append HTML that looks like this to this container right here with ID container, right? So I want everybody to just warm up and just get a sense of how do we do that first, right? That's problem number 1. Let's put some stuff on the page. So again, I'll put these side by side. If you have a computer, you can work on the computer, but otherwise you don't really need one. You just really talk through the steps. But the idea is that the HTML should look like this. You're iterating over this data, and you're putting it in this container, right? So let's warm up there for 5 minutes or so.
query selector.
And then we create
Each one is a No. You have to select where you're what you're trying to edit first. So in page, what you do is you have so when you put it in line 12, you have after. So what you need to do is you say you first do a query selector, so you do the one. Yeah,
well, it's free as a thing, since because there's like a lot of free time to do content with that's what we can do.
Okay,
for this one.
sorry, I'm like.
Reuse strings are feature, but but this is the same, right? So I just select so save that. And then I'll do insert adjacent HTML to our positions. No, so we'll be before and so you put it inside. It's insert adjacent HTML and you write position here as a string. So as a string, you just before and we'll do it on the side and then that would be create HTML. Here is where I would be so you gotta look at these back. So if we had access, because that's the sweet that we will be so I think we need to iterate on the data first and then for each iteration. Because if we're pretending that we have access to all that stuff.
Then give me a thumbs up if you're good, or if you want more. If you want more time, give me a thumbs down. One more time. More time. More time. No, you're okay. You're okay. I'll give you like another minute or two.
So you would interpolate like this bit as so this, I think this needs to be the element that that is being iterated with. So we need iteration of data. I'm not so so that's fine. So what we can do is this can be a line. You're right. So we do like for each. So like So yeah, the center has this.
Okay, let's bring him back in. Wherever you're at, it's okay. Don't worry. We're gonna talk about it anyway. So, who can give me at a high level just like a description of the things that you did, if you were to just break it down into a process? You wanna give it a shot?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really not sure, but the way that I guess I kind of thought of it was like if you're, if we're mock doing this in the console, then you have access to the HTML on the left and the data variables, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what you would do is you would make a constant variable that we call div, and that was document query selector of the div container, because that's what we're trying to do. So yeah, you grab the container div doing query selector, and then we tried to write a for each on the data variable, and then for each iteration, you would put in this whole, line 28 to 34 of that code, and you would, or 36, and you would basically interpolate the whole thing into the insert of JSON HTML. That's how I thought it.
Okay.
So you do for each, and then inside the block you would do div.insert a JSON HTML before end, and then you would interpolate for the second one the whole bit with element.name and element.description and whatever. So.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. This makes sense. Does everybody roughly have these 3 steps? Grab the container, iterate over the data, and then for each element, do some DOM manipulation. Right. In this particular case, add some data. Right. So let's actually do this. Right. Let's step 1. Grab the container div. So const, I'll call it container, equals documents dot query selector, and I want that container. So what should I put? This is fine, right? This is specific enough. There's only one container on the page, right? Let me just see if I have it. So if I refresh container, right? That's doing great. What else? Iterate over the data. Who wants to walk me through this? Carmen, why don't you go? Another one. Oh, okay. You're using arrow functions. Okay. You guys saw this in the labs. Is everybody familiar with arrow functions? It's an alternative syntax to function. If you're not, I'm just going. I will try to just write function all the time instead of arrow. But for now, as far as you're concerned, they're the same thing. There is one technical difference, but we won't talk about it until later. But keep going otherwise.
We need inside each element, right? So we need to we have a container. So you do container dot what's that method?
Insert a JSON HTML.
And you need that string. Or then the position maybe after.
Yeah, it's before end.
Before end.
I'll put it at the end. Yeah, sure.
And that string. The HTML code.
Mm-hmm. And then the same thing for description. Like that. Is that okay? Let's take a look, right? So the cool thing about this is like with this loading is like all of this JavaScript is loaded. So ideally, if I refresh, I'll just see them, right? I do have 3 cards, but something's wrong. Everything. Yeah, everything's broken, right? So what's exactly is the problem? Let's diagnose this. What's wrong here? Almost everything is right except for a few things.
So data is an array containing a bunch of objects.
Yeah.
Data the array doesn't have a single or a
Yeah. Good. So data is actually the array of all of my data, right? It's not an individual element. Like this is the individual object, and I want to actually access that, right? So where does that come into play? Where? Very good, right? It's the argument to this function, right? I think a lot of people don't. That's not always clear for people. It's like that's the argument to the function to your callback, right? What do we want to call this? Yeah, let's call it game, right? Because that's actually what it is. Like I usually like to name it after whatever it's representing. These are board games, so like the intention is like call it a game, sure. And so in place of data, what am I going to put here? Okay. Cool. I don't know. Someone from the last class said it swears by it, so I was like, okay.
It's a good one.
But yeah, you see that, right? Now, like, we're making internet, right? The cool thing about this is that if I refresh, it's always there. Why is that? Because we saw earlier that DOM manipulation doesn't, like, persist. So why is that happening?
Wait, where are you writing?
Well, it's in the
Yeah.
you have access to it all.
Yes, it's in my JavaScript file, right, which is loading with my HTML. So every time my HTML loads, all of this is run fresh and it puts it on the page, right? So these will actually be kind of permanently attached to the page, right? You'll notice if I do something like this, like put a debugger right there, what do you think will happen if I put it right here? What will the page look like when it pauses? That's right. But if I play through, then that code runs and gets added to the page. See that? Right? So just making sure that like y'all get that sense. But cool, right? Pretty straightforward exercise. Was everybody like roughly kind of like on the same track here, right? Mostly I wanted to get a sense of like everybody's like combining your regular JavaScript iteration and your sort of like computer programming stuff, like that you have plenty of experience with from mods 1 and 2. Just basic iteration and like querying like attributes on objects. That stuff should be all familiar to you. The new parts should be the construction of HTML, right? So we're still using skills that you learned in the past. We're just combining it with some new stuff here. Cool. Okay. Is this a thumb meter on like whether or not you could comfortably do this on your own?
I actually have a question.
Oh, sure.
So I see the data.for each is iterating through each object inside the array. Function game is taking a block. So where does it say that for each? How does it know that for each object inside that array it'll go through? No, wait, it's declaring game as that object that it's going through, and then it's saying. I think I get it.
Isn't that there's an anonymous function inside of for each?
Yeah. So the idea here is that like for each is a function, and as its argument, it takes what does it take?
The object is iterated over.
No.
A function.
A function, right? That function, as its argument, takes the object, right? So to kind of make this clear, I'll do it like this. Function, I'm going to call this render game. I'm going to build it out as its own function. And really, this is what you're writing, right? Render game is just a function. I can call it myself, sure. This is its own function that exists by itself. But the idea is that I'm giving it to the for each to be called by for each. For each is going to take every element of this array, pass it into this function, and then this will be called on it, like that. Is that okay? Okay. In this format, I can actually call render game myself because I have access to it. If I do like render game name, what is it? Name, I don't know, sushi. I don't know. I don't know why that's a board game, but description, slimy but satisfying.
Slimy and satisfying.
Okay. And then image, I don't know, something. Image URL, I'm just going to put just a random string, right? But the idea is that like, I have to refresh, sorry. See that? Like, I can call this function over and over again, but the idea is that I'm letting this happen for each game in this list, right? It's its own function that is capable of changing the page, but that's the idea is that like for each of these, I want to render a game. The nice thing about this is that it reads like English, right? Data for each datum in this array, render game. Right. So is that syntax getting a little bit better? Okay. Cool. So there we go. There's some DOM manipulation stuff, right? Coolios. Now what I'm gonna do here is now that we have these, you notice that I have a like button here, right? It would be nice if when I click this like button that I increase this, right? That would be super cool. So what I'm actually going to do here is like this is where event listeners come into play, right? So the way that we begin with an event listener is first we have to, and this is why query selecting is so important, find what we actually want to be listening to our event, right? Like what are our users actually interacting that we want to trigger the behavior, right? So in this particular case, what DOM element are we going to be interacting with? The like button, right? So this one right here, if I click this button, I should see the likes increase over here. So my first thing is like, let me query and grab that button, right? So let's figure out a way to get it. What can we use? Yeah, so it has like, oh, it's not image wrapper, it's this one. Yeah, it's like space button. So I wonder if I can do this. Documents.querySelector dot like. Oh, that works by itself. Cool.
But only because it grabs the first one.
Yeah, we're going to address that. That's a separate problem. We're going to talk about that later. Right, so here's a button. Cool. Is everybody okay on this? So let me find the button that I actually want to be interacting with. So I'm going to do this. Right. So that part should be familiar. The part that's new is going to be this. Button.addEventListener. Click. Now, this syntax is not complete yet. There's still going to be one more argument here. You can actually see it right there. It's like the type and then the listener. But addEventListener is a function itself on DOM nodes that the first argument is basically what type of event. Is it going to be a scroll? Is it going to be a click? Is it going to be a key press? All different sorts of events, right? There's documentation on this, which will be in the notes, but the idea is that like you can just go look up like what are the different types of events that you can use. Click is what we will use here. Now, the second argument is that it needs something to do when you click, right? So if JavaScript needs something to do, what do you think the data type of this argument is going to be? I just heard a murmur. Let's say a function, right? A callback, something to do. Right? Every time you think, oh, it needs something to do, your first thought should be it needs a function as an argument, right? So I'm going to define that inline right here. Function, right? Here is my function, really basic. I'm just going to spread it out so you can see it. And maybe all I'll do is console.log liking this. Like that. Is that cool? So no errors, seems okay. Now, I'm sorry.
Why is there not a third argument?
You don't need one. There is a third argument that has like options, but you don't need it. What do you think you need a third argument? Where would that go?
Well, it would be after the clears, there would be comma and then option.
Oh, you mean here?
Yeah,
There?
right?
Not always. No, not always. You don't need them. I almost never use those.
What does options mean? Like, what else do you do besides just like what the thing that you're listening for and the thing that you do if
Let's take a look. It literally just lists options. Let's see. Options. And options object that specifies characteristics about the event listener. So capture, indicating that events of this type will be dispatched to the registered listener. I can't explain that just yet. I will later. But once, okay, this one it will trigger it so that the event listener only ever triggers once. That's cool. Passive, a Boolean which, if true, indicates that the function specified by listener will never call prevent default. Interesting. I can't explain that until I tell you what prevent default is. But it looks like it's just options about the event listener. That's about it. But I almost never use these. These are completely optional. These are the only two mandatory arguments to add event listener, is like the type and then the function, right? It needs to know how am I listening on the page, what type, is it a scroll, is it a click? And then it needs to know like what I should do when that triggers. Is that okay? So those are the three elements of event listening are like the thing where on the page you actually want this user interaction to happen, what type of interaction, and what you want to do when the interaction is triggered. Is that okay? So 3 steps. The third, anything after that is just purely optional, and I also never use those, so it's like fine. Does everybody see this so far? Okay. You see that here? This is the button. That's where we want to trigger the interaction. The click is the type of interaction, and the function, all it does is console log. Right? So if this has worked properly, like I should be able to click it. See that console log right there?
What's the counter?
Oh, it's just how I keep clicking. That's all.
Seconds.
Yeah, it's just like, no, it's not seconds. I'm just clicking. Yeah. Is that cool?
Yeah.
Right. So here's the basics of like, I can have now my user interaction. My user triggers some JavaScript, right? That's essentially what is happening here. This button, when clicked, will trigger this JavaScript. Cool. Now, if our goal is to eventually modify this likes, can anyone think of how you might do that? I'm sorry. Appending is really more for adding stuff to the page. In this particular case, I'm actually trying to modify what's already there, right? So not quite appending. Any thoughts?
Well, if you want to keep this, like you have to store the number of events in your database somewhere.
No database. I just want to manipulate it right now. If I refresh, it's going to disappear, right? No persistence.
Make it variable with a counter, and just every time you press, just increase the counter.
Okay, but I still also need to. So that can work, right? So let me show you this. Let counter equals 0, right? And then if I do this, I can just do like counter plus plus like this. Like that. So if I click this, you won't see anything, but if I look at counter, it is actually being modified, right?
But then you're also going to have to update likes.
Yeah, that's actually the relevant point. Is like, yeah, sure, we can modify that likes, but we really need to update this number on the page.
Can't we just use the HTML for that to be like a interconnected thing of whatever our counter is?
Yes, kind of. So if you're saying that like, can I do something like this? Instead of the 0 here, can I do this? Let's see. Page isn't changing. Counter is changing.
When it's loaded, it doesn't.
No.
You have to refresh the page because it's not reading the JavaScript.
Even then, it's like, I'm not modifying my JavaScript file. I'm just modifying like the values that are stored in there. If I refresh, everything resets to all of this code, right? So no, not quite. Okay, so basically I'm going to say this. On refresh, you will not see anything saved. It's just like literally impossible as of now, right? It's the same variable, right? So like I am increasing on my console here, but counter is actually a reference to this counter. Does anybody know why it's not changing on the DOM?
Yeah, 'cause it's not re-rendered.
Yeah, good. It's not re-render. It's not calling this function again, right? So the idea is that like this function was called once for every card in that data, but it's not like this. It's not like updating fresh every time I manipulate counter, right? This happened once and only once. So even though counter's changing, it's not like this is going to change.
So we could, I know we've got span there, not using anywhere else, but we could set a CSS ID for this.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Set what? Sorry.
Set an ID for the, I know we're not using anywhere else, but
Sure.
we could set an ID for that, query the, whatever ID we set.
Okay.
Internal likes, and then just manually change the inner text.
I'm sorry.
Can I just edit in listener? Because the listener is supposed to be listening and updating every time you make a change, right?
What updating what?
You're not rendering the page all over again.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same page, so you want to show the change immediately as the same one.
Yeah.
So you should just have the counter in the listener and not over here.
So the thing is, like, if you take a look at this, right? So modifying the counter here, it's like it's not so much. It has nothing to do with like the counter being a variable or anything like this. The idea is that like we need to actually just go and manipulate what's on the page. Like it's just like that. There's no like. It's just I need to find that span and literally just change what's inside it. That's it. There's no like separate counter or anything like this. It's just whenever I click, I need to do some DOM manipulation, stuff that we saw earlier, and just change what's inside that span.
So it's another query selector.
Yeah, actually, yes, right? So, I'm sorry. It's another query selector, right? So basically, we need to find this span and modify it, right? Combine it with what we learned earlier, and actually just like on click, find the thing, change it, right? Because I could do that myself. Like for instance, I could do documents.querySelector. What is it called? Counter. Better refresh. Oh, I didn't save. Sorry, that's my bad. Okay, cool. So you see this? Like, there's my span, and you can actually see it's right there. If you see, it's like highlighting blue. Actually, see that? Right. So I have this query selector. I can find it, and I could do something like this: inner HTML, or sorry, inner text equals like 1. Right, and it does update there. So the idea would be to synthesize this interaction with this event listener, right? So what do you think should happen here? When I click the button, what am I going to do? I'm sorry? Add 1 to it, right? So, but first, even before I do that, it's like I first need to do what? I need to find the counter, right? Because that's the thing, I need to find the thing that I'm going to modify. So const counter equals this, right? What's next? Counter plus plus.
Only if the event was.
I'm sorry.
If click.
If click. I'm already being clicked. Like counter plus 1. Yeah. What is counter here? Let me ask you. What is counter? What is it?
It's the number. It's just what it is.
Let's actually raise our hands on this. So what is counter?
Isn't it pointing to where we have it in the HTML text?
Good. So what is that called? What have we been calling that? A DOM. Yeah, a DOM node. It's a DOM node, right? It's not a number. I can't just like increase it, right? But it does have. How did I read that value earlier? How did I inner text, right? So I could read the value like this using inner text. So, the counter itself I can't plus equal 1, but inner text should give me back like the number, right? But it's what? How about this? Let me just console log it first. Let's just see what it is first. Right now it's 1 because that's what's there, right? So it seems like I can grab that inner text. It is a string, I'll tell you that, Almost anything you read from the DOM is a string. So what do you think? We can grab the inner text. What are your thoughts on? We do need to change it. So at some point we're going to be doing this, right? But what do we set it equal to?
That counter that you have for inside the
Well, it's a string right now, right?
Yeah.
So we have to do the line above counter inner text. We have to do like counter to number.
It's a parsint.
Parse it, right, and then you do that, right, and then it would be number plus one.
Do you see that it works first? Let's actually just accept, like, let's accept first that this works, right? But then let's actually then dig into this and figure out like what exactly is happening. Can someone explain what's going on there? Here.
So we're first pulling out, going to the HTML, we're pulling out the counter.
Good.
And since it's a string, we're parsing into an integer, and then we're increasing that exact part of the HTML.
Yeah, I'm gonna clarify some language. So the part about the counter is great, and then we said we're grabbing the number, we're increasing it. What are we actually increasing here? What is this bit of code doing? This highlighted bit. Yes.
Inner text, you have
Perfect.
to enact, like, inner text is the function, like, it is acting on counter.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not counter.
It's an attribute. This is the word.
It's like it's a value.
Yeah, it's an attribute of this object. So counter itself is a DOM node. It has an attribute of inner text, and when I run this, it will return to me whatever text is in there, right? So right now, if I were to click this, what will counter.innerText evaluate to right now? 19, right? Then what do I do with that number?
Maybe an integer because it's a string 19.
Good. So what is num going to be?
The number 19.
The number
Just
19.
said parse int of the string of counter.innerText.
Good. So it's the number 19. What is num plus 1 going to evaluate to?
The number plus, you just do numbers plus
In this case?
Yeah.
No, keep going. I want to finish this and then we can ask questions. So this will evaluate to 20, and then what does this line do?
It sets counter.innerText equal to that number. It's
Good.
you're stating or you're reassigning counter.innerText.
Good. So I read the inner text, right? I do some sort of calculation based off of it, and then I reset the inner text. Yeah. But ask your question. Yes.
Add event listener.
Mhm.
Is that also an attribute? Or is it like, what is that?
So add event listener, technically, because button is an object, add event listener is an attribute, but what's its value? If we're getting really technical. No. It's a function, right? So I'll often just shorten that and say like add event listener is a function on the button, but technically,
An attribute that is a function.
yeah, the value points to a function, right? That's actually the most technical way to describe it, is that add event listener is just a key, but its value is a function, right? So I will just shorten that and I will just say like add event listener is a function, right? Yes.
So that's, you kind of were getting at what I was asking about, what I was going to ask about, which is, so counter is an object with, you said, with attributes,
Mm-hmm.
rather than, because I'm thinking about, I would refer to it as a key or a value,
Mm-hmm.
not as an attribute. An attribute would be
Is
the
the key.
value pair,
Yeah, you can say that, yeah.
so the whole attribute would be the
Yeah.
key value pair.
Yeah, you might hear me say like, what is the key of that attribute and what is the value of that attribute?
Okay.
Yeah. What's that?
So when you're setting something to inner text, whether it's integer, well, obviously string is fine, but if it's integer, will it automatically put it into string?
Yeah, yes it will. That's right.
What's button? Like, what are all the things that this button is?
Well, first of all, button is just an object, right? Just key value pairs, right? But let's like take a look at it. Right? It's a DOM node. It has all these button things. It has like all the things that a DOM node would. It has like, you know, if I were to look at this, it's got button.style. You saw me manipulate this earlier. It has a class name. It has, I don't think it has an ID. I think it's empty. But yeah, it's empty. But it's basically a DOM node. It's the HTML represented in JavaScript.
So I understand that it's like, I understand that it's a DOM node, that it's an object. The attributes that are inside of it, like all of the whole mess of all of the stuff that you just showed us,
Mm-hmm.
is it also a type of data structure? Like,
What do you mean?
Like, calling on like its attributes yields sometimes HTML data structures or like node data structures, right? Like not truly arrays or hashes.
They're all JavaScript though. They're all, like basically everything in JavaScript is an object, right? So what we'll find is like, so for instance, like button.children gives me this HTML collection, but technically HTML collections are also objects. Arrays are also objects, right? All these things are technically objects, right? So they're all JavaScript. There's nothing like, it's all JavaScript. If you really understand objects, then you understand these things as well because everything is an object. So button.children, right? Like, I don't know, button.addEventListener. If I just look at addEventListener, it points to a function, right? But the idea is that like button itself is just an object. It's just straight up key value pairs. That's literally all it is. It's nothing fancier than that. It's just like they are slightly special in the sense that like they also, if you manipulate that specific object, it also affects what's on the page. That's the only thing that's unique about them. But otherwise in your JavaScript, it's exactly the same as any other object. It has key value pairs. What is this? I think it will tell me that it's like of a specific class, but let's see. It will probably tell me it's a node. Oh, no, it's an object, see? What's up? What's up?
So I have a couple questions which are just like about the nature of like nodes, like DOM nodes versus objects.
Mm-hmm.
So like are all, like objects have methods, like the object class has a method. Has methods, right? Like length or whatever.
Yeah, those are more like attributes, but yeah, sure. Like,
Attributes?
yeah.
Okay, right.
Okay.
That's fair.
So I want to say that technically speaking, there are only really attributes. There are no like methods, and there are no methods, and there are no value. Everything is just an attribute on objects. They just store different things. Sometimes, for instance, like button.children,
Right.
the value that's stored there is an HTML collection.
It could the value could
It could be a function.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
That's the difference.
So then, are all nodes, regardless of like their equivalent HTML, created with all the same attribute keys?
Yeah.
So all nodes.
There might be some special ones, but for the most part, like they all have the same stuff. Like if I look at this button right here, if you were to look through this and just like look through all the stuff on here, you would find that probably 95 to maybe 100% of them are the same as every other DOM node.
Or like you wouldn't even use them.
Yeah, I don't really use most of them. Yeah. But the idea is that like all these DOM nodes are equivalent. They all have the same attributes, like roughly the same attributes. Some special ones might have some additional ones, but for the most part, they're all the same, right? The same attributes, right? Yeah. Okay, that question that went pretty far from where we started. I was just trying to get this button to increase, right? So like, so let me talk about this again, right? So let's review this one more time. In adding event listeners, you need to A, find the thing that you want, where you want to listen for the event. Oh my God, it's so far. B, figure out how you need to add an event listener to it and figure out what type of event you actually want to trigger it. And then C, you need to figure out what you want to happen in your code when that event is triggered. Those are the three things for event listening, right? Now you can do something as simple as console log. That's the simplest thing probably you can do in an event listener, but you can get as complicated as you want inside of this function. As we're starting to see, we're going to synthesize our DOM manipulation with our event listeners. And the idea is that like, I could do all this stuff manually, right? But the idea is that when the user clicks, and only when the user clicks, do I want that number to increase, right? Does that make sense? So it's like, I want the user to be able to affect what's on the page. So I capture their input using an event listener, but I write the DOM manipulation. Is that okay? So now this works. Okay, works fine, right? Is everybody okay with this?
Should you do a listener for every like button, or can you do something like
That's the next question. So that's actually that's the next question we're going to get to, right? So the tricky thing is that like, does this do anything? No, it does not. Why not? This second like button. Yes.
So, one thing I'm not understanding is we're doing this all on console. If you wanted this to actually be part of our website,
What do you think?
we could put it, I mean, we could function and call it somewhere.
Yeah. Where would we write that function though?
In
In Next.js, right? So the idea is that like I could actually just take all this code and put it right there.
And it's just gonna run.
Yeah, because it just runs, right?
Right, it goes to the
Yeah. So I actually often do this. Is like oftentimes I will like go in here and then like see what works and like I will like run some code and then I will just go into my console and just write new code, see what works, and then I will just import. I just like literally paste it into my like JS file. But you see here like without having run anything in my console, refresh, and that functionality is there, right? Is that okay? Does that make sense? Right. See, because I just put this code in here, right? So right now we're just working in our terminal so we can just like see it happen live and just mess around with it. But if like you're finally satisfied with what you have, you can just put in your index.js. Just throw it in there. Right? Yes.
Oh wait, you're not doing persistence.
No, I am not doing persistence. No persistence. Don't even think about that. Don't even think about like after the refresh. Right? It's just like we won't get to that till Thursday. Okay. On a similar note, actually, I want to ask y'all a question. Will this work if I put the code up here?
Yes, because it's running more than once. Like you're defined, like it knows which things it's defining first. So it would know counter, like you would know about counter and then you're gonna call it later. No, yeah.
Because like I'll explain the distinction in a second, but yeah.
I think only because you choosing only the first like button, because your selector is choosing the first one and not all the buttons.
Well, that you're getting ahead of yourself. That's what it like. What I mean is like, will this code work at all? Because like we already saw that it was working for at least the first like button, right? But I want to know, will this code even run now? Right? The answer is no. Let me show you why. It actually errors out, right? So to your point, you're saying it's read twice, but remember that only works for like things that are defined. So this function is defined, and that the first read through looks for this function, defines it, puts it at the top. But these are actually, like right here, add event listener, that is actually code execution. So the event listener is already in the second run through. So it's not like, that's not part of that, right?
Because it's only for like it only listens the first run through only runs through like or is only looking for like how things are defined and like stating something equals something. But
Yes.
it'll never when
It doesn't
comes time to returning anything, it doesn't care about that until the second
Yes,
run through. And
yes.
then the second run through does it all in order.
Yeah, and then it's all in order, right? So can you explain with that in mind, knowing that these are run in order, why is it that like this, it's saying actually cannot read property add event listener of null, and line 24. So what is null on this line?
Button.
Yes,
is null.
button itself is null.
Yeah.
Why is button null? And why does it matter if it's up there or down below the next block of code? Good. So button doesn't exist because, any idea? Yeah, what line is it made on? Technically, it's made on line 35. Because this right here is actually just a function definition, but it doesn't actually get invoked until line 35. You see that? Does everybody see that distinction? Like, I want to make that super clear that like this is a definition of a function, but the actual invocation where it actually gets used to put stuff on the page isn't actually until line 35, or is actually on line 35.
So you said button is made until it gets called.
Yes.
Can we open up that function again just so I can see that? So it's being made in 36 button class.
Yeah. So technically speaking, like, let me ask you a brain teaser question. If I take this render game function and put it here, will it work? Who thinks it will work if I put render game above the add event listener? Who thinks it will work?
Oh no, it still won't work because it's not being made until 50.
Good. Right? Because this is just a function definition. It's not actually being called. It's not actually doing anything to the page itself. It's this line that actually adds stuff to the page, right? I'm gonna move this all up. Right? It's actually, this is the one, this is where stuff gets added to the page, right? This is just the definition of that function, but it doesn't actually get invoked until line 41. Yeah. Is that clear for everybody? I'll make that like super clear, like what's actually happening. So if I refresh, now it works. My event listener works fine, right? So the order does matter in this regard because like, especially, and you'll find that the reason why I show you this paradigm of like building stuff off of data is because that's what you will eventually do. Eventually you will get data from an endpoint on an API and you will use that to put stuff on the page, right? So the idea is that like, you're not gonna write static HTML, you will fetch data and use that data to then put stuff on the page, right? So the idea is that like, this is a very common paradigm for you to do is like iterate over some data and then render it, right? So we also have to consider like order, right? That's going to be a super important concept. It's like this button that we're trying to add event listener to does not exist until we actually render a button onto the page. Yes?
When you say we're gonna potentially get like in the real world, like render data from like other sources and other HTML pages and other APIs,
Mhm.
essentially, do you like in those situations, what happens when it changes? Like API developers like switch some stuff. Do you have to redo your code if like the way they're like actions are tested or whatever change? And second, can like do you have to like download all of it and have it be static? Can't you just like say as their like API changes how that like because you'll just link to that, right?
Yeah,
Like,
so
like they can get like be able to do storage from like somebody else's data.
So to answer both of those questions, take a look at this. This is actually the Pokemon API. You see, do you notice this thing? Right? The idea is that like developers are usually pretty good about this. Like when they change their API drastically, for instance, they change the structure of their data, they actually just produce a V2 of their API and leave V1 alone. So anyone who is depending on V1, their websites don't break. This is a courtesy that developers do for each other because like yeah, if I change my API and other people are using it, it will just break entirely like anybody who's using it. So the idea is that the courtesy is to have multiple versions of your API and that like you leave the old ones alone and build a new version of it that you can then say like, oh, this is the most up-to-date one, right? It's the same database, but like might give you JSON data back in different format, right? So does that answer your question? Cool. So yeah, like yes, you're right that if that could be a problem, but developers have agreed upon like this as a paradigm. It's like everybody cool. Yeah. This actually happened to me recently. I was like building something, and Google actually straight up deleted one of their APIs, and I straight up my website doesn't work anymore, and I can't find a good substitute. So yeah, that does actually happen. They completely deprecated one of their products. They're like short URL shorteners. So they had this URL shortener that you could just API that you could use for free, and I was using it, and now my website can't make short URLs, which sucks. Anyway, whatever. But that actually happens. It's a real thing. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Sorry, we keep deviating from like this thing, but like, I mean, they're all great questions, right? They're all very interesting questions. But we at least like let's stick with this, right? So the idea is that like we're trying to kind of Tanya's point earlier is that like the like button doesn't work on any of the other ones. Why does it not work?
First, it's finding that specific one, and second, you have to specify, like, when you set the variable, like, the button, or whatever you set the variable to, it's specifying that specific reference,
Yes.
where it found, like, container.
Yeah.
Right?
So the main issue here is that like, yeah, you're right. The problem that we have is that we find the very first like button. and we attach our event listener to that button, and we also only find the very first span, and that's the one that we modify. So everything is like very specific, right? It's like very specific to the one that we're modifying, right? And that's not great. Obviously, I want to be able to add event listeners to this, to all of these things. Now, there are a couple of solutions. The best one is what I will show you tomorrow. What I'm going to show you right now is like the not great solution, just to show you that it works, but it's like weak sauce, right? It's not actually like the real way that we should do stuff. So I'm going to show you that. So keep in mind that we will fix this with like what we call event delegation. That's actually tomorrow's lecture. But let me show you how this works. So the idea is that we want to be able to attach an event listener to. There's 3 ways to do this. One is that we could attach an event listener directly to each button as it's made, right? That would be cool if we could do that, something like that. As we make the buttons, can we just attach an event listener to every single one and specify to specifically modify that span? That could work. That's like solution number 1. That would mean that my adding event listener would need to be inside of the iteration, right? Basically inside of this render game, because I would need to do it for each single button, right? That one I'm not going to show you. It's really not like ideal. Basically, like if you had 100 cards on the page, how many event listeners are there going to be on the page? 100, right? And this actually, it turns out, is actually pretty inefficient. So I'm actually just going to avoid that one entirely, right? That one, but the idea is that like you could do that if you wanted to. Does everybody see that as a potential solution? It's like, as it's made, attach an event listener directly to it. Sure, that could work, but I'm going to skip that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something that's kind of approximating what we're going to do tomorrow, but not the best. One interesting thing about this is that like, it kind of uses a little bit. Okay, fine. I'm going to comment this out for a second. Right, we found that this doesn't work because this works for a specific button. I want to find the clearest way to illustrate from here. Okay, what is? Yeah, so one solution is that like we could do this. Instead of attaching to one button, we can actually const buttons equals query selector all, like that. Find all the buttons, and then do what? Yeah, this is actually kind of a similar solution, but like let's run through this and like let's see how this works. As I mentioned, this isn't going to be great, but let's actually take a look at it. So this line of code is going to find all buttons with class name like, right? Let me actually just see that works. So there you go, right? All 3 of my buttons. Now, how can I now actually want to add an event listener to every single one, which, as I mentioned, is also not really a great solution, right? Because we're going to have a lot of event listeners. But screw it, let's just run through it, right? Let's just make it work. What do you think we're going to do? Not really. I didn't even do that. Anybody? Thoughts? Right. Inside my iteration, actually, to be honest, I can just copy and paste this. Because it's the same code, right? What happened there? Oh. I'm sorry, what? Oh, yeah, sorry, I've just been doing that. I just assumed that you... yeah, // is comments. Yeah, it's the same shortcut, yeah. So...
There's also, // is one line, but / star, and then // is
multi-line, like...
So wouldn't we need to change the document that counter? Isn't that still on the first one?
Great. I want to show the problem first, right? Before, like when I do this. But let's actually look at this logic and just make sense of it, right? So here's all my buttons. For each button, I'm going to run this function. Now this function, for each button, it's going to add an event listener a click event listener, and it will run this code. Who thinks this will work? Okay, not breaking, right? Oh, okay. But then, who thinks that this will work?
Yeah, because it doesn't know which that they're like different in time.
Yes. Explain it based on this bit of code, right? So like, what is that? What is actually? Why is it always modifying the first one? Yeah, this is still tied specifically to the first like counter, right? Which it shouldn't be, right? It should be unique to each one. So then the question becomes like, okay, well, I need to find the specific one, right? Does anyone have any ideas on how to do this? There's actually a couple ways also to do this, but does anybody have any ideas, first of all?
Well, the only thing that's changing is the button argument that we have now, so instead of using that.
Good, right? That's some great logic right there, right? Is that like based on this button, we need to sort of like use that to determine like which span to target, right? I'm sorry, what?
I have no idea.
But that's great. That's like step one to realizing, right? Is like we need to think about that first. What's up?
Because we can use just the index, and just instead of number, use the square bracket with an I.
So you want to use like the index. So the idea would be then to like instead, in a very similar fashion, we can actually find all of the document.querySelector all counters like this. All change this to counters. And ideally the indices should match up, right? So the second argument, by the way, to a for each is actually to this function is actually, you can actually grab the index like this. Yes, you can grab the index like that. If you look up the documentation, they have all the arguments. The basic one is always just like the element, but the index, you can add it as a second argument if you like, if you need it, right? So in this case, we are going to use it. So I could do something like this, like counters, square bracket, index, right? This relies on the fact that like the index of the button is the same as the counters index. Like it should be the first button should be for the first counter, and so on and so forth, right? Let's actually see. Okay. It's just a number. So in this case, it's like 0, 1, 2, 3. It's like literally the index, but it's just the second argument to whenever you iterate over anything, right? Yeah.
Oh, it's just like an index.
It's the index.
I was thinking like Ruby index for a second. I was in the wrong.
A Ruby index?
It's fine.
Oh, like it.
Yeah.
Like, okay. No, it's just like array index. Yeah, that's what I was like.
So really quick, so on 61, you're getting all the counter selectors.
Yeah, I'm grabbing all the counters.
And then
Sure.
on 64, number is parsed integer, counters. So inside the counter, is it all the counters? There's something called counter 0. Oh, it's an array.
It's an array.
Counter is the array itself of objects.
Yeah.
0.
Yeah, the index is just like I'm relying on the fact that like the buttons will match up. Like the order in which the buttons are found will be the same as the order in which the spans are found. It is relying on that fact, and so I can use the index from the buttons to match up with the counter. Does everybody see that? Right. So that works. Like as we can see, it works okay, right? Cool. Does this okay with people? Like as far as like the logic goes? It's like this actually isn't like as I mentioned earlier. It's like you can see why like some people would resort to this because it's not that bad, right? It's actually like okay. As I mentioned though, adding a lot of event listeners to the page is far from ideal, but it's also like the logic is also pretty straightforward. So at least it has that benefit. What's up?
Why? So like, what is the like issue with adding a lot of event listeners to a page? Like, is it the show page just all event listeners basically?
It's just like inefficient because like each one is independent of each other and like it literally occupies space and memory.
So then like how do you account for a lot of web pages that like it's just all event list, like in which like there's a shit ton of interaction with like a few pages?
So the interesting thing that I'll show you tomorrow is that I can actually replace all of this with one event listener using a technique called event delegation. That's actually the what we're building up to, and why I need to illustrate this as a problem, is that we're going to use a technique tomorrow called event delegation to sort of like, in combination with this thing that happens in events called propagation. So we will use those things in together, and actually you will find that there's only going to be one event listener on the entire page, or at least for an entire container. So that way, like, not every button has its own individual event listener. What we'll see tomorrow is that I can just put one on the entire container, and it can activate for all of them, right? But it's a technique, right? So I need to show you this first, and then build up to it. Is that okay?
Can you just go through the logic?
Sure. So do you get this part? Is everybody okay, comfortable with this part of like, find all the buttons, iterate over each button, add an event listener to it? Is everybody okay with that part? It's like I can actually just grab all the buttons and give each one their own event listener.
Is there a reason we want to iterate over the buttons rather than iterate over the tiles? So we're going to have to do the index chain.
Well, we could go over the tiles and just go through the tree. That's like another way, right? The thing is, like, relying on the tree is also a little bit hairy, but maybe we can also look at that as a solution. So let's explore that afterwards. But does everybody at least get that logic?
The index argument,
Mhm.
the anonymous function, does that get passed by for each?
Yes. I just haven't shown it to you, but yeah, it does.
Okay.
For the most part, when we do for each's, like, I just didn't need it, so I didn't include it.
Okay.
But this time I just needed the index, so I included it.
I didn't.
Okay.
Cool.
Was that it?
That
Oh, okay.
was me.
Okay. Yeah, the index is like maybe a little bit mysterious, but again, this relies like very closely on the fact that like, that they're found in the same order, which is typically going to be the case, but like not often. Well, it doesn't happen all the time. So this can be a little bit like, could be potentially a little bit janky. But I want to actually pursue what Wilf mentioned, is actually like, could we potentially just grab, in kind of the same vein of things, could we just grab the whole tile and then add an event listener to a button within it, and then also find the right span? Could we do all of that at the same time? I don't know, let's see. The answer is yes. But we're actually just going to go through it together, right? So this is one solution. And this is actually like, find all the buttons, iterate over them to add event listeners. Then in each event listener, find matching span counter, and change inner text. Right, so that's actually what this basically that's what the logic is, just written out in like plain English. But I'm gonna do one other thing, and I'm just gonna run through this myself. Here, I'm actually going to, instead of doing this, I'm actually gonna grab all the tiles, and I'm gonna iterate over the tiles instead. Okay. Now, first things first, I'm just gonna make sure that I actually have it. So if I look at the console, tile is not defined. Oh, yes. Cool. Each of my individual tiles. So it looks like I have them. Now, the interesting thing is that, like, you remember like query selector I can do on document, right? The interesting thing about query selector is that you can use it on any DOM node, and you can look inside of that thing for more stuff. So here's my tile. What if I just wanted a button like that? Oh. So I'm just going to console log it, right? See that? Each one matches like that. So the cool thing is that, like, I can say const button equals this. Oh, oops. So this is the cool thing about query selector, is that you can chain it onto, like, once you have a DOM node and you want to look further inside of it, you can use query selector on that DOM node to just look again, right? It's like, oh, I want to look for specifically the button in this tile, right? So I can do this, and then I can do something like this. Button.addEventListener. So again, kind of the same deal. Function, click, then function, like that. And what's actually going to happen here is that like, I need to now find the counter. We're assuming that this logic is going to remain roughly the same, right? Once I have the right counter, I can actually just, this stuff will remain the same. Oh, thank you. Right? But ideally, I need to find some sort of counter. My question to you is like, how could I use a similar strategy to find the relevant counter? I'm sorry.
For each always have an index, right?
I'm sorry, what?
Does for each always have an index?
In this case, I don't need it. That's why I don't include it. But if I needed it, I could just write it in there. But I don't, actually.
Can you do like query selector?
Yes, good, right? I could use a similar strategy that I used to find the button to then find the right span, like this.
Wait,
I'm sorry?
what is spam?
It's the counter. It's, sorry, where is it? It's this thing where the number is.
Or you can do
Yeah, that's not really how you're supposed to use IDs anyway. But like this is more, yeah. So let me find a span inside of it. A span is just like a text thing, right? Is everybody okay with this?
single line.
So take a look at this, right? The idea behind this is that like I can use a similar strategy. It's like if I have the parent of all of this stuff, I can actually use query selector to then find the right button, add an event listener to it, and then also find the right span. If that makes sense, right? So this will actually should work. See that?
Which is more likely to be more memory intensive, going through all the files to do this, or
So this is actually probably a little bit easier. I don't. In terms of memory, I don't think it really matters. To be honest, I don't think that there's like that much market. They're kind of the same. I think this is just easier to read as code. It also is like a little less fragile because it doesn't depend on like the lining up of these indices, right? It's actually just saying wherever the heck this span is and wherever the heck this button is, just find it in this parent, right? So I iterate over all my tiles, and then I use the advantage of like being in the entire tile to then query select, right? Which is kind of cool because I can do this for each tile. Is that okay? Yes.
so if you've got a bunch of, say you have the tile have a bunch of different spans for different reasons, would it be bad practice to basically make up your own HTML tag to easily find it?
No, you don't make up HTML tags. Like instead, you should add a class name to it, like this, and then say specifically, I want the span with class name counter. This is the right way to do it. Is everybody okay with that? So yeah, you're right. If there were a lot of buttons, for instance, consider this. Like I could add more buttons here, like dislike, the dislike button, or something like this, right? And the idea would be that like I have multiple buttons, and the problem is that like since there are multiple buttons, like this doesn't work anymore. But I could do like button with class like specifically. Cool. Right. So let's do that. Still works just fine. Cool. Who likes this more? Who likes this strategy? Okay. Is it who's even if you don't like it, who's like comfortable with this? Okay. Yeah, okay. They're kind of very similar. You notice the code is very similar, right? Like fundamentally they're actually not like that different. But like just the ease with which we find stuff is just I find the second one just like simpler in that regard, right? Sorry, say it one more time. Yeah, right. Like I think this one is just like a little bit more like it's a little bit more complex and like hard to come back to. Whereas like this is pretty straightforward. Like you can actually read this and figure out what it's doing. I think that's why I like this code a little bit.
There's also a pattern to it because you're doing the query selector on the tile.
Yeah. So one thing to note about JavaScript, and like this is just a problem with JavaScript in general, is that like Well, one is that like it's very like loose, right? As we noticed, I'm sure people were just like, as soon as I typed this in, this was like completely jarring. They were like, what the heck? And like it's because like it doesn't yell at you for having the wrong number of arguments. It's just like, oh great, you didn't want the second one, then I won't give it to you. Right? So that it's as simple as that. So like number one is that JavaScript has like all these like hidden features and stuff that like usually kind of confuse people. The second thing about JavaScript is that there's so many ways to do the same thing. Like that's also another problem with JavaScript. And they're like, I could think of the three ways that I just mentioned. There's a bunch of to make it so that like you can click on this. I mentioned that there's only three. There's actually probably far more. I can actually think of more already, but there's three that actually like make sense. But there's a lot of different ways. You can kind of do everything in any way, right? So I think the most important thing is like that as you move through JavaScript, you latch onto like you make your own pattern. Like what am I going to do, right? I think that try to break it down into really simple steps, which is why I try to get into like this habit of like talking about them. It's like grab the stuff where you want to add your event listener to, right? That's always the first thing. Figure out what type of event you want it to be, click scroll, and then 3, figure out what you want to do, right? Those are always the 3 steps to adding event listeners, regardless of your strategy, right? You always do at least those 3 steps. What's that?
You know the alt that you can put in HTML? Is there any way to find stuff like alt?
Yeah, there is. So you're not gonna like this, and like people like hate this, but I'll show it to you. You can also, so you know how like dot means class, and then hashtag means like ID. You can also you can find any attribute using square brackets like this, but it has to match exactly. So you could do like alt equals like that. Like this works, right? Actually, we will actually find a use for this like tomorrow. But the idea is that like if you like dot is for class names, hashtag is for IDs. Any other HTML attribute you write like with like square brackets like this, but you can select off of that.
You are correct. I don't like that.
Yeah, this is like ugly as hell. Like it's not really, it's very not pretty. But I will show you this tomorrow because there is a use for this. Yeah. Any other questions? No? Okay. So what we're going to see tomorrow is like, we're actually going to explore the use of this thing called the data set, right? And we're going to look at event delegation because what we're going to be able to do tomorrow is attach a single event listener to this entire container and just listen to all the events. And what we're going to explore more tomorrow is this idea of like there's something I haven't shown you yet here too, is that the argument to this function, to this callback for your event listener is actually something that we call the event. And this is an object with its own sort of like, oh God. This is an object with its own sort of like, take a look at that. Like tons and tons of attributes.
Wait, and when on the screen, like it's always listening for clicks. Like the event I'm thinking is like specifically where you're clicking.
Yeah, you notice that like you see this like.
Y coordinates of all of this stuff, is that like specifically your mouse is zeroed into a particular place on the screen and it's like that thing?
Yep. So to get a better sense of that, if you take a look at this, oh no, where is it? Where did I put it? Oh, I lost it. God dang it. Sorry. You remember this thing that I showed you earlier? Do you see this client Y and client X? Does that look familiar from over here? That's actually your mouse position. That's why it's able to insert like a div wherever your mouse is. But that's actually what the event is for. It actually, as we're going to see tomorrow, it's like that thing is actually what contains all the information about like the actual event itself. Like,
That's why when you said there's only one event listener that will take in all, like per click, it's only one event listener for like a click interaction.
Mhm.
And where the X and Y coordinates of the positionality of the mouse is, it'll trigger an interaction or not.
it's actually not even as hard as that. There's actually just a special attribute called target that just tells you what you clicked on. So we're actually not even going to need to calculate it. But yes, you're right. The idea that the event is going to tell us like what we interacted with, like we're actually going to be able to use the event to tell us that, right?
Wait, so can you go back to the code real quick? Event in the functions there,
Mhm.
like event is an like everything's an object, I
Mhm.
assume.
Yes.
So that event is an object with all of, when you scroll back, like all of the other attributes, the purple, those event has all of those attributes in it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Where is event stored?
It's not stored anywhere. It's passed in as an argument. It's actually created by add-event-listener. So what happens here is that, like, remember that because this function here is a callback, this function that I've just highlighted is a callback that's called by add-event-listener. The idea is that, like, add-event-listener is the one that passes in the event in the same way that the tile is what gets passed in from the for each. Do you remember that? Like, I pass a function to for each, and for each is the one that passes the information over into my function. It's the same deal here. It's that, like, this event is actually managed by add-event-listener, and when it calls my function, it will pass it in. Hmm.
I have a problem. The creation of event happens when? Because when you're calling at event listener on button, it's always listening. But like, is event created upon click? Or is event created, like, is it just an empty like object with none of those attributes if you haven't clicked yet? Does that make sense?
Oh, that's actually a really advanced problem. It's called event pooling. We're not going to talk about that. So just assume that it's created fresh. Don't worry about it. Just assume that, like, basically every time I click this. So take a look at this. If I click it, right? Notice that the client X and client Y are here. But if I click over here, notice that the client X and client Y are actually different, right? It's actually, so what can you infer from that?
It's saying there's a range of like clicks of like place on the screen.
No, it's not even that. It's actually, that's not what I meant. What actually I meant was that, like, based on the fact that, like, I clicked, it's triggering the same event handler, but they have different values, means that it's generated at the time of the click. That's what I meant to infer, right? The idea is that it's triggered based off of, it's triggered based off of, it's triggered based off of, like, when the event is triggered, right? So the event object is unique to every time that event is triggered. So
Assume that event is created upon click.
yes, you can assume that the event is created upon click. Yes, right. Or if it's a scroll event, upon scroll, right? Or on key press when you key press. Is that okay? Okay. Cool. Cool. So tomorrow we'll actually learn, and we'll make this a little bit better, right? Because, like, we've gotten some of the basics of event listening, but we haven't really used the event too much. We're going to use this to our advantage tomorrow and, like, figure out, like, what exactly can we do with this. That's our lecture on event delegation. So right now it's just like play around with your events, figure out how they work. Like, again, if you want to, I'll send out this, like, that bit of code and just try to dissect what you think it's doing. The thing that's adding the stupid iframe to the page, right? So you can actually just, like, mess around and see if you can figure out, like, what exactly is going on with that code. If you can understand that code, then I'd say that, like, you're in the right spot, right? Tomorrow we'll work on, like, making this a little bit better so that, like, we can only have one event listener on the page. Cool? Cool. Thank you. That's it.